The tale I'm about to share with you has nothing to do with grand political maneuvering or the exploits of celebrated historical figures. Instead, this is a story about a rather peculiar Prussian gentleman whose relationship with Victorian Britain could best be described as antagonistic, and whose solution to life's challenges seemed to consistently involve appropriating items that belonged to other people. Bernard PFO, a man whose very name appears in multiple variations across official records, apparently viewed the British Isles not as a land of opportunity, but rather as an elaborate catalogue of unattended possessions just waiting to be liberated. Before we dive into the specifics of Bernard's criminal curriculum vitae, it's worth establishing the broader context. The 1880s in Britain were a time of profound social transformation. The Industrial Revolution had fundamentally reshaped the landscape, creating new forms of wealth and equally new forms of poverty. Cities swelled with workers, railways crisscrossed the countryside, and the British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. Within this sprawling imperial apparatus, there existed countless individuals whose lives left barely a trace in the historical record. Itinerant musicians, casual laborers, ex-soldiers from continental wars who drifted from town to town seeking work, shelter, and occasionally opportunities for petty theft. Our protagonist fits squarely into this category of the historically invisible. He surfaces in official documents only when he comes into conflict with the law, and then disappears again into the murky world of model lodging houses and temporary employment. What makes Bernard's case particularly interesting isn't the nature of his crimes. Petty theft was hardly unusual in Victorian Britain, but rather the meticulous bureaucratic response his actions provoked and the eventual solution that authorities settled upon, simply sending him back across the Channel. The year 1886 found Bernard in Bishop Stainton, a modest village situated near Tynemouth in the county of Devon. He did not arrive there as a respectable immigrant seeking to establish himself through honest labor. He did not present himself to the local authorities as a refugee seeking sanctuary. Instead, his first documented appearance in this corner of England occurred in the harness room of Holloway House, where he was eyeing up a particularly attractive overcoat. John Panter worked as a coachman at Holloway House, and, like many men of his profession, he took pride in his appearance and the quality of his working attire. The coat in question was a substantial piece of outerwear, valued at £3.10. Not an insignificant sum when you consider that a skilled laborer might earn 15 to 20 shillings per week. This wasn't just any coat. It was a proper working garment with practical features. Tucked into its pockets were a hammer and a pair of gloves, tools that Panter used in the course of his daily duties. Panter had developed the habit of hanging this coat in the harness room during his midday meal. It was a sensible arrangement in a household where everyone knew everyone else, and where petty theft was presumably rare enough to make elaborate security measures unnecessary. The harness room was a workspace, not a strong room, and Panter had no particular reason to suspect that his property might be at risk. On the morning following one particular lunch break, Panter discovered that his coat had vanished. The hammer was gone as well. And so, as it would turn out, was a German stranger whom nobody had particularly noticed until that moment. Bernard had apparently decided that the coat suited his needs better than it suited Panter's, and had acted accordingly. Now, if this were a work of fiction, you might expect what follows to be a thrilling chase sequence through the Devon countryside, perhaps along the dramatic coastal cliffs, with our protagonist dodging between fishing boats and finally being cornered at some picturesque seaside location. Reality, as is so often the case, was considerably more mundane, but no less interesting for that. What we have instead of a chase scene is something that tells us far more about how Victorian policing actually functioned. A constable methodically making inquiries, following a trail of witness testimonies and casual observations from one location to another. The policeman assigned to the case trudged from Bishop Stington into Teignmouth, conducting his investigation through patient, systematic questioning. This was detective work in its most basic form. No forensic science, no fingerprint analysis, just shoe leather and careful attention to what people had noticed. And in a small community where strangers stood out, people had noticed quite a bit. Someone in Teignmouth remembered seeing a foreigner, specifically identified as a German, playing what was described as an accordion or concertina in the village around 5 o'clock in the evening. This detail is worth pausing over. Street musicians were a common sight in Victorian Britain, part of the vast informal economy of busking, begging, and casual entertainment that helped many people scrape together enough money to survive. What made this particular musician memorable was the incongruity of his appearance. He was wearing what witnesses described as a decent coat, the sort of quality garment that didn't quite match with his occupation as an itinerant performer. Another witness provided an even more crucial piece of information. The same German man had been observed selling that very coat at a public house called the Beehive to a local painter named Samuel Sanders. This transaction deserves our attention because it reveals quite a bit about Bernard's approach to disposing of stolen property and about the moral ambiguities that characterized such exchanges in Victorian England. According to Sanders's later testimony, Bernard entered the Beehive and ordered a pint of beer. Then, in what might have seemed like a gesture of continental generosity, he offered to buy Sanders a drink as well. Sanders, whether from temperance principles or from a streetwise suspicion about strangers bearing gifts, declined the offer. He had presumably encountered enough situations where unexpected generosity preceded requests for favors or offers of questionable merchandise. Bernard then proceeded to tell Sanders an elaborate story. He claimed to be a deserter from the Prussian army who was attempting to reach Aldershot to visit his brother. The coat, he explained, had been purchased in France as part of his disguise, and since he now found himself short of funds, he wondered whether Sanders might be interested in purchasing it for 5 shillings. This narrative had all the hallmarks of a story crafted to elicit sympathy, while also explaining why a man might be eager to sell a valuable coat for a fraction of its worth. Sanders borrowed 5 shillings from the landlord and completed the transaction. Later, when questioned by authorities, he admitted with admirable honesty that the coat was actually of no particular use to him. This wasn't a carefully orchestrated fencing operation involving professional criminals and established networks for disposing of stolen goods. This was simply a man in a pub performing a quick calculation. The coat probably was stolen, but it was also genuinely cold outside, and 5 shillings represented a bargain that was hard to refuse, even if accepting it meant becoming an accessory after the fact. Meanwhile, our diligent constable continued his methodical investigation. He failed to locate Bernard in Teignmouth itself, but through continued inquiries, he traced the suspect to a model lodging house in Crediton and arrested him there. Model lodging houses deserve a moment of explanation, as they were a distinctive feature of Victorian social infrastructure. These establishments were created in response to the appalling conditions that prevailed in many common lodging houses, where disease, violence, and exploitation were endemic. Model lodging houses, by contrast, were designed to provide clean, affordable accommodation for working men and women. They were regulated, inspected, and generally maintained to a higher standard than their less reputable counterparts. The fact that Bernard was staying in such an establishment tells us something about his circumstances. He wasn't completely destitute, he had enough money to afford decent temporary accommodation, but he was far from settled or secure. When confronted by the police, Bernard's initial response was straightforward denial. "I have not been there," he insisted, referring presumably to Holloway House and the harness room where the theft had occurred. This is a perfectly understandable response from someone who has just been arrested. Denial is often the first line of defense, especially when you're hoping that perhaps the evidence might be less conclusive than it actually is. However, Bernard didn't maintain this position for long. After spending some time in the cells, that period of isolation and reflection that tends to clarify one's thinking, he abandoned his denials and provided what amounted to a complete confession. His account was remarkably straightforward and devoid of elaborate justification. He had gone into the courtyard at Hollamy House, he explained. He had seen the coat hanging there. He had observed that nobody was around to witness what he was about to do. And so he had taken it. There was an almost refreshing honesty to this admission, stripped as it was of any attempt to claim misunderstanding or accidental appropriation. At this juncture, allow me to interrupt the narrative flow momentarily. If you're finding this historical deep dive interesting, I would gently encourage you to engage with this content. Whether that means subscribing to follow more stories like this, or simply making a note to return for future installments. These tales from the archives require considerable time to research and construct, and your engagement helps justify that investment of effort. Moreover, if you're the sort of person who prefers to verify facts rather than simply accepting narratives at face value, you should know that every newspaper report, court record, and official document referenced in this account is available for inspection through properly cited sources. Transparency in historical research isn't just good practice, it's essential. Now, returning to Bernard's legal predicament. He appeared before the magistrates and entered a guilty plea to the charge of stealing the coat. The bench sentenced him to 3 months' imprisonment with hard labor. This sentence tells us several things about Victorian penal philosophy. 3 months was a substantial sentence for theft of this nature, reflecting both the value of the stolen property and perhaps some exasperation with a foreigner who had shown such casual disregard for English law. The addition of hard labor was significant. This wasn't simply confinement, but confinement combined with physically demanding work, often involving tasks like breaking stones, picking oakum, or working a treadmill. There was, incidentally, another charge that could potentially have been brought against Bernard during these proceedings. It emerged that he had also stolen trousers and a shirt from a woman in the same village. However, the authorities chose not to pursue this additional charge. The court records note somewhat delicately that this matter was left not gone into. This decision might have reflected simple judicial efficiency. Bernard was already being sentenced for the coat theft, and adding another minor theft charge would have complicated proceedings without materially affecting the outcome. Or it might have reflected some element of mercy, a reluctance to pile charges onto a man who was already facing punishment. Fast forward through those 3 months of hard labor. Bernard serves his sentence in a Victorian prison, and we should pause to consider what that actually meant. Victorian prisons were harsh institutions, designed not for rehabilitation, but for punishment and deterrence. The daily routine was brutally monotonous. Hard physical labor, minimal food, silence enforced between prisoners, and sleeping in cramped cells that were often cold and damp. The hard labor component might involve the crank, a handle that prisoners were required to turn thousands of times per day, doing literally pointless work designed solely to exhaust them. Or it might involve the treadmill, where prisoners climbed an endless staircase that powered mill machinery, or simply spun uselessly as a form of punishment. Following his release, we might have expected Bernard to reflect on this experience, and perhaps reconsider his approach to life in Britain. We might have hoped that 3 months of punishment would prove sufficient deterrent to prevent future criminal activity. These expectations would prove to be wildly optimistic. Less than a year later, specifically in February of 1887, we find Bernard in Worcester, a city in the West Midlands, considerably distant from the Devon coast where his previous adventure had unfolded. The target of his attention this time was not a coat, but rather a bicycle. This seemingly simple shift in the object of theft actually represents something quite significant about the period we're discussing. The bicycle had recently undergone a technological revolution. Earlier versions, the penny farthing with its enormous front wheel and tiny rear wheel, had been dangerous contraptions that required considerable skill to ride and were prone to throwing their riders over the handlebars. But by the mid-1880s, the safety bicycle with two wheels of equal size and a chain drive had been developed. This innovation made cycling accessible to a much broader population and triggered an enormous boom in bicycle ownership and use. The bicycle that Bernard appropriated was valued at £5, a considerable sum, indicating this was a quality machine, not some rickety second-hand contraption. It had been taken from the yard of the Royal Oak Inn, where its owner had presumably left it with the reasonable expectation that it would remain unmolested. The Royal Oak was a coaching inn, one of those establishments that served as important nodes in Britain's transportation network. These inns provided accommodation, food, drink, and stabling for horses, and increasingly in this period, they also served as places where the new bicycle-owning class might pause during their journeys. For Bernard, the bicycle represented an irresistible opportunity. It was valuable, it was portable, or rather, it was mobile in a way that made escape seem straightforward, and it was apparently unguarded. He took the machine and proceeded to ride away, no doubt feeling quite pleased with himself. However, his success was remarkably short-lived. He didn't manage to get far before being apprehended. When Bernard appeared before the magistrates in Worcester, he attempted a different rhetorical strategy than he had employed in Devon. Rather than simply confessing and hoping for leniency, he now presented himself as a man with a distinguished military background. He informed the court that he had served in 5 battles during the Franco-Prussian War. This claim demands our careful attention and skepticism. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871 had been a transformative conflict in European history. Prussia and its German allies had decisively defeated France, leading to the unification of Germany and fundamentally altering the balance of power on the continent. The war had indeed mobilized vast numbers of men. Prussia's military system was based on universal conscription, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers had participated in the conflict. Many of these men had subsequently found themselves demobilized in a peacetime economy that struggled to absorb them all. Former soldiers often possessed skills that were easily portable: marching in formation, performing military music, drinking with impressive capacity, but not always easily monetizable in civilian life. So was Bernard's claim true? It's entirely possible. A man of his apparent age in 1887 would have been the right generation to have served in that war. The Franco-Prussian conflict had produced exactly the sort of displaced veterans who might end up wandering across Europe, taking temporary work where they could find it, and occasionally supplementing their income through less legitimate means. However, it's equally possible that Bernard was simply spinning a yarn, calculated to impress or generate sympathy from English magistrates. Claiming military service was a time-honored strategy for men in his position. It suggested discipline, courage, and a certain respectability even in reduced circumstances. It implied that here was a man who had served his country honorably and had fallen on hard times through no fundamental flaw of character, but rather through the cruel vagaries of fate and economics. Whether the magistrates believed this story or simply acknowledged it with polite skepticism, we cannot know from the surviving records. What we do know is the outcome. Bernard was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment with hard labor. This was a shorter sentence than he had received in Devon, which might reflect the lesser value of the stolen item, or might indicate that the Worcester magistrates were inclined towards some degree of leniency. 1 month of hard labor was still a serious punishment, but it was not the crushing sentence that might have been imposed for more serious offenses. Let us step back for a moment and consider the geographical dimension of Bernard's activities. Within the space of approximately 1 year, he had moved from the Devon coast to the West Midlands. This was not a trivial journey in the 1880s. While the railway network had indeed made such travel vastly easier than it would have been a generation earlier, it still required resources, money for tickets, or failing that, the physical stamina to walk considerable distances. Bernard's mobility reveals something important about his lifestyle and circumstances. He was not rooted in any particular community. He had no fixed address, no stable employment, no family ties that anchored him to a specific location. This sort of geographical mobility was actually a survival strategy for many people in his position. As an itinerant musician and casual laborer, moving from place to place allowed him to find temporary work, to perform for new audiences who hadn't yet tired of his repertoire, and, crucially, to stay ahead of any reputation he might have been developing as a petty criminal. However, this strategy had an obvious weakness. While mobility might help you escape the immediate consequences of your actions in one location, it also meant that you were always a stranger, always conspicuous, always someone whom local residents would remember and describe to investigating constables. In small Victorian communities, foreigners stood out. A German accent, continental mannerisms, and the slightly shabby respectability of an itinerant musician. All of these made Bernard memorable in ways that probably worked against his interests. By May of 1887, just a few months after his conviction in Worcester, we find Bernard in Yeovil, a market town in Somerset. Once again, he had travelled a considerable distance, this time moving southwest from the Midlands, back toward the West Country. And once again, he found himself unable to resist the temptation of unattended property. The objects of his desire this time were a pair of hand trucks belonging to a brewer named Earl Vincent. Hand trucks, sometimes called sack trucks or dollies, were simple but valuable pieces of equipment consisting of an L-shaped frame with wheels, used for moving heavy barrels, crates, and sacks. For a brewer, such equipment was essential for daily operations, and while not enormously valuable, the trucks represented both practical utility and financial investment. The circumstances of this particular theft reveal Bernard in what might be considered his natural element, operating under cover of darkness, improvising explanations when caught, and demonstrating a somewhat optimistic faith in his ability to talk his way out of trouble. The local newspapers found Bernard's predicament sufficiently amusing to grace him with a headline, "A Foreigner in Trouble." This phrasing is instructive. It wasn't simply "a man in trouble" or "thief arrested." The foreign nature of the accused was considered newsworthy in itself, worthy of highlighting in the headline. This tells us something about how provincial English communities viewed continental Europeans who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. When Bernard appeared before the magistrates, he was once again attired in what was described as military costume. Whether this was genuine military surplus or simply clothing that gave that impression, we cannot definitively say. He renewed his claims of belonging to the Prussian artillery, attempting once more to wrap himself in the mantle of military respectability. One wonders whether he owned any civilian clothes at all, or whether the military appearance had simply become his default presentation, a sort of personal brand that he hoped would confer dignity even in degrading circumstances. The actual theft had occurred late on a Friday night. A constable on patrol spotted Bernard wheeling the hand trucks away from Vincent's brewery, heading in the direction of the lodging house district in Reckleford. This detail about timing and direction is significant. Friday night would have been when many working men received their wages and subsequently spent them in public houses. The streets would have been busier than usual, with more people about, which makes Bernard's decision to steal the trucks at that particular time seem either boldly opportunistic or somewhat desperate. When challenged by the constable, Bernard did what he apparently did best. He tried out multiple explanations in rapid succession, hoping that one might prove persuasive. His first claim was that he had found the trucks. This is a classic defense in theft cases. I didn't steal it, I merely found it lying about, presumably abandoned, and was in the process of determining what should be done with it. The weakness of this explanation, of course, is that honest finders of lost property
generally don't wheel it away toward lodging houses late at night. They report it to the authorities, or leave it where they found it.
When this explanation failed to convince, Bernard pivoted to a different strategy. He claimed he was drunk and didn't know what he was doing. This defense has the advantage of admitting that yes, technically he had taken the trucks, but he bore no criminal intent because his faculties had been impaired by alcohol. Victorian magistrates heard this excuse with great regularity, and their responses varied depending on their individual attitudes toward both drunkenness and criminal responsibility. The brewer, Earl Vincent, appeared before the magistrates and provided testimony about the value of the stolen items, approximately 35 shillings. This was not an enormous sum, certainly not in the same category as grand larceny, but it represented a meaningful loss for a business owner. However, Vincent then did something rather unexpected and revealing. He informed the magistrate that because the accused was a foreigner, he did not wish to press the case vigorously. This statement deserves careful unpacking. Victorian Britain's relationship with foreigners was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, there existed genuine xenophobia, suspicion of outsiders, particularly those from continental Europe, who might bring dangerous political ideas or simply compete for scarce jobs and resources. The late 19th century saw periodic moral panics about foreign criminals, anarchists, and other threatening figures. On the other hand, there also existed what might be characterized as patronizing sympathy, a sense that foreigners who committed minor offenses were perhaps not fully responsible for their actions because they didn't properly understand British customs and laws. This attitude combined elements of superiority. We British know how to behave properly, but these continentals are rather confused, with a certain noblesse oblige. It would be unseemly to come down too hard on someone who is, after all, a stranger in our land. Vincent's statement that he didn't wish to press the case because Bernard was a foreigner reflects this second attitude. There's an implied suggestion that a confused Prussian artilleryman, if indeed that's what he was, staggering through Yeovil with a pair of brewery trucks, was more pitiable than threatening. The theft was an inconvenience, certainly, but perhaps not one that required the full weight of British justice to come crashing down. The magistrates imposed a fine of 10 shillings including costs, with the alternative of 7 days' imprisonment if the fine could not be paid. This was a relatively lenient outcome compared to Bernard's previous sentences. It offered him the possibility of avoiding jail time altogether if he could scrape together the necessary funds. Whether he paid the fine or served the 7 days, the records don't definitively tell us, though given his apparent financial circumstances, imprisonment seems the more likely outcome. At this point, if we were charting Bernard's criminal career, we might see it as a somewhat depressing but not particularly unusual pattern. A coat in Devon, a bicycle in Worcester, hand trucks in Yeovil. Each theft followed by arrest, conviction, and punishment, followed in turn by release and another theft. This was the revolving door of Victorian petty crime, the endless cycle that kept local prisons filled with repeat offenders whose crimes were too minor to warrant transportation or execution, but too persistent to simply ignore. However, Bernard's story takes a significant turn with his third major offense, an act that would prove to be qualitatively different from his previous petty thefts and would ultimately seal his fate with regard to his continued presence in Britain. This was no longer a matter of opportunistic pilfering of coats, bicycles, or brewery equipment. This time, Bernard crossed a line that Victorian society took considerably more seriously. In July of 1888, in the village of Stoke Prior near Leominster in Herefordshire, Bernard was charged with breaking and entering a chapel or meeting house with the intent to commit a felony. The significance of this offense cannot be overstated, as it represented a fundamental escalation in the nature of his criminal activity. Let us first consider what Bernard had actually done. The building in question was a small dissenting chapel, not one of the great Anglican cathedrals or even a substantial parish church, but a modest meeting house used by nonconformist worshippers. In the complex religious landscape of Victorian Britain, such chapels played an important role. They served communities of Baptists, Methodists, Congregationalists, and other Protestant denominations who had separated from the established Church of England. These buildings were typically simpler and less ornate than Anglican churches, reflecting both the theological preferences of nonconformist communities and their generally more modest financial resources. But despite their simplicity, they were sacred spaces, places where communities gathered for worship, where marriages and funerals were conducted, where the spiritual life of the congregation centered itself. When Bernard broke into this chapel, he was no longer merely taking someone's personal property from a yard or a harness room. He was violating a space that communities considered holy, a place set apart for divine worship. Victorian society, despite its commercial and industrial character, remained deeply religious in both its public rhetoric and its legal framework. Religious observance was expected. Church attendance was socially enforced in many communities, and sacrilege, even the relatively minor sacrilege of breaking into a small chapel, was treated as a serious offense. The legal charge reflected this seriousness: breaking and entering with intent to commit a felony. This was not simple larceny, not just stealing something that happened to be in a chapel. The breaking and entering element indicated forced entry, a deliberate breach of security. The intent to commit a felony meant that Bernard was being charged not just with trespass, but with planning to steal items of sufficient value or to commit some other serious crime once inside. We don't know exactly what Bernard was after. Perhaps the chapel had collecting boxes that he hoped contained donations. Perhaps there were candlesticks, communion vessels, or other items that might be sold. Perhaps he was simply looking for shelter and thought an empty chapel would serve that purpose. The records don't specify what, if anything, he actually took or attempted to take. What mattered legally was that he had broken in with criminal intent. The case was serious enough that it could no longer be handled at the level of local magistrates in a petty sessions court. Instead, it was elevated to the quarter sessions at Hereford. This shift in jurisdiction is significant. Quarter sessions were courts that met 4 times per year and dealt with more serious criminal matters than could be handled by local magistrates. They had greater sentencing powers and conducted more formal proceedings. The fact that Bernard's case went to quarter sessions indicated that the authorities viewed this as a substantial criminal matter, not merely another instance of petty theft. On the printed calendar for the Hereford quarter sessions, Bernard appears with slightly more biographical detail than we've seen before. His name is recorded as Bernard Poe, another variation in the spelling that would plague any future researcher trying to trace his movements. His age is given as 44, and his occupation is listed as musician. This occupational designation is interesting because it suggests that, despite his criminal activities, Bernard still identified himself, or was identified by others, primarily as a musician. The accordion or concertina playing that witnesses had mentioned in earlier cases wasn't just an occasional activity, but apparently his primary means of earning a legitimate living, or at least his primary self-identification. Crucially, the indictment noted his previous conviction at Worcester in February of 1887 for stealing the bicycle. This detail meant that Bernard was now being treated as a repeat offender, someone with a documented history of criminal behavior. 3 years earlier, when he had first stolen the coat in Devon, he had been an isolated offender, a one-time criminal who might have simply made a mistake. Now he was a man with a pattern, someone whose name appeared in multiple police records across multiple jurisdictions. The system was beginning to recognize him not as an unfortunate foreigner who had committed an isolated offense, but as a persistent problem that required a more permanent solution. When Bernard appeared before the court at the Hereford quarter sessions, he made a decision that had become something of a pattern in his interactions with the British legal system. He pleaded guilty. This consistent willingness to admit his offenses is worth reflecting upon. Some might interpret it as evidence of a certain honesty, or perhaps resignation to his circumstances. Others might see it more cynically, as a calculated strategy. Guilty pleas were known to result in somewhat lighter sentences than those imposed after contested trials, as they saved the court time and expense. The court, having heard his plea and considered his previous convictions, sentenced Bernard to 12 months' imprisonment with hard labor. This was by far the longest sentence he had yet received. 3 months for the coat theft in Devon, 1 month for the bicycle in Worcester, a fine or 7 days for the hand trucks in Yeovil, and now a full year behind bars. The escalation in sentencing reflected not just the seriousness of the chapel breaking, but also the court's growing impatience with a man who seemed utterly unable or unwilling to conform to British law. 12 months of hard labor in a Victorian prison was a genuinely severe punishment. Consider what this meant in practical terms. Bernard would spend an entire year engaged in grueling physical work, designed to break the spirit as much as to occupy the body. He would live in conditions of enforced silence, sleeping on a hard plank bed in a cold cell, eating minimal rations of bread, gruel, and occasionally a small amount of meat. The daily routine would be monotonous beyond description. Rising at dawn, working until exhaustion, eating tasteless food, and then returning to solitary confinement in his cell. The hard labor component meant different things in different prisons, but common tasks included oakum picking, the tedious and painful work of unraveling old rope fibers, which left prisoners' fingers raw and bleeding. Other prisoners might work the treadmill, climbing an endless rotating staircase that powered mill machinery or simply spun uselessly as a form of punishment. Stone breaking was another common assignment. Prisoners would be given a pile of large stones and a hammer, and required to break them into smaller pieces suitable for road construction. The work was exhausting, pointless, and deliberately designed to be demoralizing. But if Bernard thought his sentence would end with 12 months of this ordeal, followed by release back into the world to continue his wandering musician's life, he was about to discover that the Victorian state had other plans. The bureaucratic machinery that would ultimately determine his fate was already beginning to turn, and its detailed record-keeping would prove far more consequential than he might have imagined. In October of 1889, when Bernard was finally discharged from Hereford Prison, the prison authorities did something that speaks volumes about Victorian approaches to crime and criminal identification. They entered him into what was known as the Habitual Criminals Register, and in doing so, they recorded his physical characteristics with a level of detail that borders on the obsessive. The Habitual Criminals Register was a relatively new innovation in British law enforcement. Established in the 1860s, it was an attempt to create a systematic record of repeat offenders that could be consulted by police forces across the country. The theory was straightforward. If a criminal could be identified by his or her distinctive physical characteristics, then even if that person moved to a different jurisdiction and gave a false name, the police might still be able to recognize them from their physical description. This was an era before fingerprinting, before photography was routinely used in police work, before DNA analysis or any of the sophisticated identification techniques that modern law enforcement takes for granted. What the Victorians had instead was careful verbal description, recorded in permanent registers that could be consulted whenever suspicious characters appeared. The description of Bernard that was recorded in the Hereford Prison Register is extraordinarily detailed, and it's worth reproducing in full because it tells us more about him than any other single document. The clerk who wrote these details did so with meticulous care, creating what amounts to a word portrait of a man who otherwise would have left almost no trace in history. Bernard had a fresh complexion, meaning his skin tone was healthy and ruddy rather than pale or sallow. His hair was light brown, his eyes were blue. These basic descriptors placed him firmly within the range of Northern European physical types, exactly what one would expect from a Prussian. His height was recorded as 5 feet and 7.5 inches, which by Victorian standards was about average for a man. His build was described as proportionate, meaning he was neither particularly thin nor heavy, neither muscular nor frail. His face was oval in shape, But the clerk didn't stop with these general characteristics. He proceeded to catalogue Bernard's distinguishing marks with remarkable thoroughness. There was a wart on his left cheek, the sort of minor blemish that might help identify someone at a distance or in poor light. His right forearm bore tattooed initials, BP. This tattoo raises interesting questions. Were these his actual initials, or did they stand for something else? Had he acquired this tattoo during his military service, or was it something from his earlier life? The records don't elaborate, but the presence of the tattoo itself is significant, as tattoos were relatively common among soldiers and sailors, but less common among the general population. Then the description takes a turn into territory that might strike modern readers as surprisingly intimate and intrusive. The clerk recorded that Bernard had a large wart in his right groin. This level of physical examination suggests that prisoners were subjected to thorough and undoubtedly humiliating inspections, stripped naked and examined from head to toe, so that every possible identifying characteristic could be catalogued for future reference. The Victorian state was leaving nothing to chance in its efforts to create a comprehensive record. The inventory continued. Moles on his chest, and finally, 2 scars in the center of his back. These scars are particularly intriguing. How had Bernard acquired them? Were they souvenirs of the military service he claimed to have performed in the Franco-Prussian War? Battle wounds from those 5 engagements he had mentioned to the Worcester magistrates? Or were they from some other episode in his life? A workplace accident, perhaps, or an altercation in one of the many lodging houses and public houses where he had spent his time in Britain? We will never know the answers to these questions, because the bureaucratic gaze that recorded these physical details with such precision was spectacularly uninterested in the narrative that might explain them. The Victorian state cared deeply about creating a complete physical description that would allow Bernard to be identified if he committed future crimes. It cared not at all about his biography, his motivations, his childhood, his hopes, or his disappointments. What we have, then, is a man pinned to paper like a specimen in a Victorian naturalist collection. Every physical characteristic has been noted, measured, and recorded in permanent ink. Bernard the person, with whatever dreams and plans and memories he carried, has been reduced to Bernard the dataset: height, weight, hair color, eye color, distinguishing marks. This was the power of Victorian bureaucracy in full effect, transforming a human being into a series of descriptive categories that could be filed, cross-referenced, and consulted as needed. And then, at the bottom of this meticulous description, the clerk wrote one final entry under the heading, "Destination on discharge." Just one word, but a word heavy with implication. Germany. This brings us to the central question of Bernard's story. Was he actually deported? The answer is more complicated than you might expect, because Victorian Britain didn't have the sort of formal, systematic deportation procedures that modern nation-states employ. There were no immigration tribunals, no detention centers specifically designed for holding foreign nationals awaiting removal, no scheduled flights back to countries of origin. Instead, what existed was a far more improvised and informal system, a messy combination of police pressure, consular arrangements, and quiet suggestions that everyone's life would be easier if the problematic foreigner in question simply agreed to return home. Local authorities who were tired of repeatedly arresting and imprisoning the same individuals might coordinate with the relevant foreign consulate to arrange passage. Sometimes charitable organizations might be involved, providing the money for a ticket home as a form of poor relief that also conveniently removed a source of concern from British soil. The legal framework for this was murky. The Aliens Act of 1848 had given the government certain powers to remove foreign nationals in times of war or political emergency, but it wasn't routinely applied to petty criminals. Instead, What happened to people like Bernard operated in a grey area between formal deportation and strongly encouraged voluntary departure. From the authorities' perspective, sending Bernard back to Germany made perfect sense. He had demonstrated over several years and multiple convictions that he was either unwilling or unable to support himself through legitimate means in Britain. He had no family ties that anyone could identify, no stable employment, no fixed address. He represented a persistent drain on the justice system and the prison system. Every time he was released, he would commit another theft, be arrested again, sentenced again, imprisoned again. This cycle was expensive and seemed likely to continue indefinitely. From Bernard's perspective, though we can only speculate about his actual feelings, the deportation probably felt like exactly what it was: forced removal. The distinction between being formally deported through legal channels and being told that the authorities had arranged passage for him back to Germany and it would be very unwise to refuse this generous offer would have seemed academic at best. The practical result was the same. His time in Britain was over, not because he chose to leave, but because the British state had decided he needed to go. The fact that Germany was written in the discharge register as his destination suggests that this wasn't a vague plan or a suggestion, but rather a definite arrangement. Someone, whether prison officials, local police, or consular representatives, had taken concrete steps to ensure that Bernard would not simply be released back onto the streets of Hereford to resume his pattern of petty theft. Instead, he would be escorted out of the country, put on a boat crossing the Channel, and return to German territory. What happened to Bernard after he crossed back over the Channel? The archival record, having followed him with such meticulous attention through his criminal career in Britain, falls completely silent once he leaves English soil. We don't know whether he returned to Prussia, or rather, by 1889, to the German Empire, since Prussia had been absorbed into the unified German state. We don't know whether he attempted to resume the life of an itinerant musician there, or whether he found some other means of supporting himself. We don't know whether he had family who took him in, or whether he remained as rootless in Germany as he had been in Britain. Most poignantly, we don't have a confirmed death record for Bernard. He disappears from the historical record as abruptly as he appeared in it. One day he's being released from Hereford prison with instructions to proceed to Germany. The next, as far as the archives are concerned, he might as well have never existed. This is the fate of so many people in his social position. They surface briefly in official documents when they come into conflict with authority, and then they vanish again into the vast, undocumented mass of ordinary people living ordinary lives of poverty and struggle. Let us step back and consider Bernard's story in its broader context. What does his experience tell us about Victorian Britain, about migration, about crime and punishment, and about the ways that modern nation-states dealt with people who didn't fit neatly into their social and legal frameworks? First, Bernard's story illuminates the experience of continental European migrants in late 19th century Britain. This was a period of significant migration, with people moving across Europe in search of work, fleeing political persecution, or simply trying their luck in new locations. Britain, as the world's leading industrial and imperial power, attracted many such migrants. Some came with skills and capital and established successful businesses. Others, like Bernard, arrived with little more than their labor and whatever talents they possessed, and struggled to survive in an often hostile environment. The reception these migrants received varied enormously, depending on their circumstances. Skilled workers, professionals, and those with financial resources might be welcomed, or at least tolerated. But poor migrants, particularly those who committed crimes or required poor relief, faced suspicion and hostility. There was a persistent anxiety in Victorian Britain about becoming a dumping ground for Europe's unwanted population,
criminals, paupers, and political radicals who might corrupt the native working class or burden the poor law system. Bernard's repeated encounters with the law and his eventual deportation reflect these anxieties in action. Each time he appeared in court, his foreign status was noted and remarked upon.
The newspaper headline, "A Foreigner in Trouble," captured a prevailing attitude. This was not just any criminal, but specifically a foreign criminal, and that distinction mattered. It implied that his crimes were somehow connected to his outsider status, that perhaps he didn't fully understand British law or British values, or alternatively, that he embodied precisely the sort of undesirable element that Britain should not be allowing to enter and remain. Second, Bernard's criminal career reveals something about the nature of Victorian petty crime and the people who committed it. His offences, stealing a coat, a bicycle, hand trucks, breaking into a chapel, were not the dramatic crimes that dominate historical narratives. There was no murder, no grand robbery, no sophisticated fraud. These were opportunistic thefts of relatively modest value, committed apparently on impulse when the opportunity presented itself. This sort of petty criminality was endemic in Victorian Britain. The vast majority of prosecutions in this period involved precisely these kinds of minor property offences. Thousands upon thousands of people passed through the courts each year, charged with stealing food, clothing, tools, or other items of daily life. Many of these offenders were desperately poor, taking what they needed to survive. Others, perhaps including Bernard, occupied a grey area between necessity and opportunism. Not quite starving, but never secure, always looking for ways to supplement their meagre legitimate income. The question of why Bernard repeatedly committed these thefts is one we cannot definitively answer. Was it genuine need? He claimed at various times to be a musician earning money through performance. But was this sufficient to support himself? The fact that he stayed in model lodging houses suggests he had at least some money. These establishments charged a small fee per night, typically 4 to 6 pence. But model lodging houses were the accommodation of the respectable poor, not of those with secure employment and regular income. Alternatively, perhaps Bernard had what we might today recognize as an impulse control problem or some other psychological issue that made it difficult for him to resist taking things that didn't belong to him. Perhaps his years of military service, if indeed he had served in the Franco-Prussian War, had damaged him in ways that Victorian society didn't recognize or understand. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized as a medical condition in the 1880s, but the symptoms certainly existed, and many veterans struggled to readjust to civilian life. Or perhaps, more prosaically, Bernard simply made rational calculations that the benefits of theft outweighed the risks. A coat worth £3 10 shillings represented weeks of potential income from musical performance. The risk of getting caught was real, but so was the immediate benefit of having a valuable item to sell or use. Each time he was released from prison, he might have genuinely intended to stay on the right side of the law, only to find himself once again facing the choice between cold, hunger, and unemployment on one hand, and quick illicit gain on the other. So we return to where we began: 3 crimes, 3 convictions, and 1 final solution. A coat from a harness room in Devon, a bicycle from an inn-yard in Worcester, and forced entry into a Herefordshire chapel. These were not the acts of a master criminal or a dangerous revolutionary. They were the desperate, opportunistic choices of a man who found himself perpetually on the margins of Victorian society, never quite managing to establish the stability that might have kept him on the legitimate side of the law. What ultimately drove Bernard onto the roads of England in the first place remains one of the great unknowns of his story. Was he genuinely a deserter from the Prussian army, as he told the painter in the Beehive Inn all those years ago? Did he really fight in 5 battles during the Franco-Prussian War, as he claimed to the Worcester magistrates? Was there ever a brother in Aldershot, or was that simply another convenient fiction crafted to explain his presence and generate sympathy? The historical documents that have preserved Bernard's story are maddeningly selective in what they record. They give us everything that the Victorian legal and penal system cared about: his age, his height, his eye color, his scars and warts, the precise value of items he stole, the exact length of his sentences. They document with bureaucratic precision every encounter he had with police and magistrates, every night he spent in prison, every detail of his physical appearance that might aid in future identification. But they tell us almost nothing about the person beneath these catalogued facts. We don't know where in Prussia he was born, or what his childhood was like. We don't know if he learned to play the accordion from his father, or picked it up as a soldier, or taught himself during long nights in lodging houses. We don't know whether he had loved ones who mourned his deportation, or whether he was as alone in Germany as he appeared to be in England. The Victorian state, for all its obsessive record-keeping, was profoundly uninterested in the inner lives of people like Bernard. From a genealogical perspective, Bernard represents both a researcher's nightmare and a peculiar gift. A nightmare because his name appears in multiple variant spellings, his birthplace never gets more specific than Prussia, and he left no marriage certificates or baptismal records in British parish registers. He passes through the historical record like a ghost, leaving only the faintest traces of his existence. Yet he's also a gift, because those 4 newspaper reports, the sessions calendar, and the prison register allow us to reconstruct an entire miniature biography. We can trace his movements across southern and central England, chart his descent from petty theft to more serious offenses, observe the legal system's growing impatience with his repeated offenses, and finally witness the bureaucratic solution: removal. In fragments and official documents, Bernard's life becomes visible in ways that more respectable migrants' lives often aren't, precisely because respectability doesn't generate court records and prison registers. Bernard doesn't receive a commemorative statue or a historical plaque. There's no grave marker bearing his name in any English churchyard. What he gets instead is scars meticulously recorded in a prison register, a concertina that may or may not have survived his journey home, a handful of criminal convictions spread across 3 English counties, and one final instruction written in bureaucratic ink: Germany. For Victorian Britain, this was deportation enough. Not a formal legal process with tribunals and documentation, but simply the quiet removal of a persistent problem. One moment Bernard was Britain's concern, the next he was someone else's, or perhaps no one's at all. The system had documented him, punished him, catalogued every physical characteristic that might identify him in future, and then efficiently disposed of him by sending him back across the channel. What we see in Bernard's story isn't just the tale of one unsuccessful criminal. We see the long shadow cast by continental warfare, which transforms soldiers into drifters, drifters into wanderers, wanderers into petty thieves, and thieves into administrative problems to be resolved through the simplest expedient available: deportation. His story illuminates how Victorian Britain dealt with those who existed at the intersection of poverty, foreignness, and crime, not with rehabilitation or integration, but with documentation and removal. Bernard PFO, Prussian musician, sometime thief, veteran of battles real or imagined, vanishes from history with the same abruptness with which he entered it. For him, Britain was never home, but merely a place where opportunities for theft occasionally presented themselves. For Britain, Bernard was never a person to be understood, but merely a problem to be solved. And in the end, both parties got what they wanted. Bernard got his deportation, and Britain got rid of Bernard.